YouTube, what y'all got going, man? We about to get into all the ways the cartel sneaks the drugs into America. Let's go.
Smuggled
In a
in this
watermelon? That's
submarine
some nigga
was
shit.
cocaine.
What
A
do
nigga did
watermelons,
that.
submarines, and
A
sex
nigga
toys
did
all
that for
have in
sure.
common? They've all been used to smuggle drugs. And that's just the beginning. In September of 1985, a smuggler named Andrew Thornton II was flying hundreds of kilos of cocaine from Colombia into the United States. However, Thornton got worried that the authorities were tracking his flight, so he dumped hundreds of pounds of blow down into the forests of Georgia and jumped out of his plane with a parachute.
Andrew Thornton fell to his death carrying too heavy of a load of cocaine while parachuting.
Unfortunately for Thornton, his parachute malfunctioned and his body was later discovered along with
Definition of
75
smack.
pounds of cocaine, a couple of handguns, and thousands of dollars in cash. Much of the coke he abandoned, however, ended up being found and eaten by a huge bear. And this story has now become the inspiration for a Hollywood movie.
It's a tale of drugs,
I ain't
planes,
seen that movie,
parachutes,
though.
and one unlucky bear.
This is how drug
Was it
smuggling has
Cocaine
gone from
Bear
a
or
few guys
something?
crossing the desert on mules
think that's
to a sophisticated multi-billion-dollar industry, and the most inventive ways traffickers have managed to move their drugs around the world. Since the very beginning of the war on drugs, traffickers have faced one big problem: how to get prohibited drugs from producer to seller to buyer. Luckily, drug cartels are incredibly innovative.
Lo que les dije, esto va a ser un vuelo con 55 kilos ya listos para su exportación.
Never.
Tenía muy buenas habilidades como deportista y ya estas
How much y'all
niñas
think he get paid?
But the roots of international drug trafficking are a lot more
I need a
basic
bag to
than
do
recruiting champion paragliders to fly bricks of coke over the rainforest. Though the war on drugs goes all the way back to 1914, the golden age of drug smuggling really began in the late 1970s and 80s. And it was largely driven by one thing: cocaine. It was the challenge of getting cocaine from the mountains of South America to the nostrils and crack pipes of the USA, which transformed drug trafficking into
The
the most
nostrils
profitable
and crack
organized
pipe.
criminal
He's
enterprise
tripping.
in history.
The American illicit drugs market is the biggest in the world, worth annually more than $80 billion. Last year, federal authorities intercepted 7,000 pounds of cocaine, 3 times the amount seized the previous year.
This was the era of the so-called cocaine
these fucking
cowboys who
cartels.
flooded Florida
Ugh.
with drugs from South America using boats, planes, and often human stomachs, and yes, rectums.
The drug smuggling operation is highly organized, and there are plenty of people prepared to risk imprisonment for the large amounts of money offered by the dealers. Some will even go through the uncomfortable process of swallowing plastic bags filled with narcotics, something that can end in death if the bags burst.
So-called drug mules are most often impoverished people who are either paid or violently coerced by cartels to swallow or insert packages of illicit drugs and smuggle them on commercial flights. And when this goes wrong, the consequences can be deadly.
If you're carrying as a mule packets of cocaine and one ruptures, the acute powder of cocaine is rapidly absorbed. It creates a disaster in the
You're gonna be off
First
that
thing they usually
shit
feel is muscle
quick.
contraction pain. Then they complain of chest pain because now the heart's starting to be affected.
But there's no way cartels could supply the endless market for illicit drugs just through people's digestive tracts. The majority of the cocaine cowboys operated fleets of small planes and boats, going from South America to the US, often through bases in the Bahamas.
A $100,000 cruiser with 2 young men on board is a classic profile case.
You guys got any guns? Okay, we're gonna board you, check the papers.
A radio linked to customs headquarters indicates the agent's suspicions are well founded.
As the authorities began to crack down on boats going over the seas, traffickers went under the surface. This was the origin of one of the most impressive feats of cartel engineering: the narco submarine.
This hard. They got
The first
some
narco subs were
green
intercepted
boy.
in the early 90s,
Yeah,
but they've surged
bread.
in use in recent years. They're assembled in underground boatyards hidden in the Amazon, and cartels can spend millions of dollars on each and every one. And that investment seems to be worth it. The largest haul ever seized in a submarine is a staggering 7.7 tons of cocaine, and only a tiny fraction of them are ever intercepted. In 2019, Spanish authorities discovered a narco sub that had actually crossed the entire Atlantic from South America to Europe.
Over the last decade, particularly emerging from Colombia, but there's been a set of
They spending $1 million
semi-submersibles, a
each. They
couple of
don't give
which
a
have been
fuck.
caught by the US Coast Guard, which don't fully submerge, but just appear above the water. And they've also been used to take cocaine up the coast
And
and
it's
to
only built to
bypass
go
the
one
border.
time. They
In the
don't
early
even want it back.
1980s, Ronald
That's
Reagan amped
crazy.
up the war on drugs with a huge crackdown on the Caribbean smuggling routes. Obviously, this did not end the drug trade because all the traffickers did was switch from air and sea to land and the 2,000-mile US-Mexico border. This is how the war on drugs created the modern Mexican cartel.
Pues sí, como por ejemplo los carteles que tienen que mantener su gente y todo, tienen que sacar dinero donde hay. Si ya se acabaron sus reservas, pues tienen que buscarlo.
How old are you guys?
Yo tengo 27.
Mexican cartels have used pretty much every method imaginable to transport drugs into the US, from fleets of airplanes to drones and literal slingshots.
Border Patrol agents near Douglas, Arizona found a catapult attached to the border wall, made to chuck bundles of marijuana into American territory. More than 47 pounds of the drug found.
But the crowning technical achievement of the Mexican cartels is almost certainly the narco tunnel. Tunnels underneath the US-Mexico border began to emerge in the early 1990s, but have exploded in use in the 21st century. Hundreds have now been discovered, some of which are thousands of feet long and equipped with electricity and purpose-built rail tracks.
Drug tunnels have been built predominantly on the US-Mexican border, where they've taken drugs from cities like Tijuana to San Diego. They were developed mostly in the 1990s, and particularly by a very famous Mexican drug kingpin called Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who famously escaped a supermax prison in Mexico by getting mining engineers to build a tunnel and then escaping through that tunnel on a motorbike.
But the vast majority of the drugs that get smuggled into the US don't actually go underground. They come in the same way as most other consumer products, over the border. 35,000 trucks and 200,000 cars cross the border from Mexico to the US every single day. And some of them are full of cocaine, heroin, meth, weed, and fentanyl.
The North American Free Trade Agreement opened up trade between Mexico and the US. So there was a real explosion in drug smuggling over the border between Mexico and the United States during the 1990s. So it wasn't so much finding a needle in a haystack as finding a piece of hay in a haystack. Completely impossible.
Once again, cartels have driven some extreme innovation, smuggling drugs in just about every product imaginable, from bananas to hair extensions. But probably most impressive is the development of the so-called trap car. Cartels have custom-built vehicles with hidden compartments which can often only be accessed by a very specific sequence of actions.
In the bottom of the center console, underneath the fake bottom, is a switch. Turn it down, nothing happens. But turn it up, and there goes the back seat, revealing a trap containing a stash of contraband.
These so-called trap cars, cars with secret departments in which you can hide fairly large quantities of drugs if you know what you're doing. And a lot of these cars have been developed on the US side of the border to take huge quantities of weapons down south to Mexico, where they're then distributed and sold just as cheaply as you can buy them in a Walmart.
It's crucial to remember that all this impressive innovation is also enabled by the fact that cartels are rich enough to bribe everyone from individual border agents to national presidents. And guess what? Andrew Thornton II, the original smuggler from the Cocaine Bear story, he actually started his career as a cop.
Thornton was on the Lexington police force for 9 years. He was a narcotics officer between 1970 and 1973.
And of course, there's no reason that drugs like weed and cocaine need to be smuggled in these crazily
they got scientists, they got
Marines,
they doing all.
So maybe the craziest thing about this whole story isn't that a bear ended up eating some cocaine. It's
really
that governments across the world thought they could stop people from wanting to take drugs by making them illegal. Good luck with that.
We'd like to congratulate drugs for winning the war on drugs.
Nah, that watermelon and the weed was crazy, man. Alright, man, J3, I'm out as well.